Welcome to The Check-In, a podcast by Telos, where we explore the headlines from Israel, Palestine, and across the world, wading into the complexity of seemingly intractable conflict to discover the power of peacemaking to heal us, our community, and our world. This is your host, David Kadaba, checking in from Washington, D.C. For those who come from the Christian tradition, we are in the second week of Advent, a time in the Christian calendar of anticipation, lament, and longing, which culminates in the arrival of Christ in the little town of Bethlehem, as we sing, to much joy and celebration in our churches. But as theologian Fleming Rutledge says, Advent begins in the dark and moves toward the light. But the season should not move too quickly or too glibly, lest we fail to acknowledge the depth of the darkness. For those of us who call ourselves Christians, part of bearing witness to that dark is turning our eyes to the land into which the light first shone, turning our eyes to both the past and present darkness that emanates from this region and the violence that we witness, to understand the context of both the first Advent in Palestine and every Advent since. This year, Advent arrives as Christ is, quote, still in the rubble, as our friend Munter Isaac, pastor of the Christmas Lutheran Church of Bethlehem, tells us. The devastation of Gaza, widely understood as genocide of the Palestinian people, is ongoing. The horror, the darkness, it seems, is so deep. Christmas last year was canceled by some communities, even of Christians in the West Bank. But we must not lose sight. We must not turn our eyes from it. And Advent as a time invites us into this witnessing and even into the lament. And it does so in full anticipation of the hope that is on its way and the invitation it has for us to step into its light as an agent of peace, even as the violence may continue on the other side. So, how can we take Advent seriously this year? We're here to talk about that this week with special guest, Telos alumna, author, and speaker, Kelley Nikondeha. Kelley is a practical theologian hungry for the new city, as she says, and author of an amazing book on this exact topic called The First Advent in Palestine: Reversals, Resistance, and the Ongoing Complexity of Hope. In this book, she unpacks the stories of the first Advent and the context in which they happened, helping us understand in new ways the narratives that have come to be so familiar to us, and yet which are still in so many ways quite foreign for those of us hearing them from our context in the U.S. But she does that while also detailing her own experiences, living and traveling throughout the region, giving us insight not only into the first Advent, but every Advent since in the land in which Christ chose to dwell. It's a powerful, beautiful, illuminating book that I highly encourage you all to pick up, and one that we need to engage in this season today, especially in light of all that has been happening in the past 14 months. So in this conversation, we talk about her life experiences that brought her to writing this book, some of the themes she believes are essential to the narratives that we often miss from our vantage point, and how she's thinking about Advent today in light of the context of the moment. I left this conversation deeply moved, challenged, and inspired by Kelley's commitment to honest lament, attentive scholarship, and sacrificial solidarity. And I imagine you will too. Enjoy the show. Well, welcome, Kelley. We're so grateful to have you with us at the check-in today. Where are you checking in from?
I am checking in from Phoenix, Arizona.
Oh, brilliant. I'm in DC, and the weather just turned to winter, like all of a sudden. And, I am not a person who enjoys the cold. So my friends and colleagues have already heard me complaining about all the layers of jackets and scarves and gloves I have to take on and off. But it's got me thinking about what is my ideal temperature. And so you're in Phoenix. It's
Yes.
warm and lovely, I'm sure. I'm curious, what is your ideal temperature?
Well, our weather has finally, at long last, chilled. So I actually consider it a luxury to feel cold,
Oh,
to be
wow.
able to pull out, a scarf and a nice lightweight
Yeah.
coat.
Yeah.
I mean, and have a warm beverage, and like, so for me, it is a luxury to feel cold. And I love when we get to this part of the season. So I love it when we are like in the 60s to 70s, where there's that, a little bit of a chill, especially in the morning, but a nice sunny day. So these are the beautiful days in Arizona. This is why people will suffer through those miserable long summers, is to enjoy these lovely winter days.
Wow. Yeah. You're selling Phoenix for me over here. I'm like, I need to buy my ticket. I don't know what I'm doing. And you know what? I think it's really fun to talk about the weather. And I know a lot of people, give it a bad rap as small talk, but sometimes we just need the simple and the fun and the joyous, especially in light of conversations that we will be having today and that many of us have been having in this season. So thanks for
Right.
indulging that fun question. But
Sure.
Kelley, I am grateful, especially for you to be joining us in this season of Advent. Many of us who come from the Christian tradition are preparing our spirits and our bodies for a season and a time of anticipation, of longing, of expectancy. But many of us are trying to do that in light of the current realities happening in Israel, Palestine. In this season, we turn to the story of Christ's birth in this little town of Bethlehem. And today, Bethlehem is a city that is under a very extreme set of circumstances, right, as we know. So we're going to talk about what it looks like to turn our eyes and our ears to this part of the world in light of this Advent story in the next couple of weeks as a part of our practice for those who come from this tradition. Before we dive into all of that, into your brilliant book, I would love to hear just a little bit about who is Kelley and who's showing up here today in this conversation.
Yeah, what is my social location, right? now
Yeah,
that you know where I'm physically located.
right.
Well, I actually am a California girl. I grew up in Southern California, down in Orange County. So I love the beach, love the Pacific Ocean. But that also means I grew up kind of in the heart of a very white, very, very heavily evangelical Christian space. That's kind of the family system that I come from. I will say also lots of Christian Zionism. I would never have named it back then. I wouldn't learn about that word or the political dynamics around that till much later. But that is where I come from, was raised into that evangelical space. I am a writer I've always been a writer, whether it's in a journal or in other formats. I have the luxury of now publishing some books, so I can also say I'm an author. But I am a liberationist, so I definitely read the biblical text, both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, through the lens of liberation and ways in which we can be set free. And that does have a lot of political overtones, which often makes people nervous when I say that I'm a liberation theologian. But I've learned as I've gotten older to deal with it
Yeah.
because that is actually how I see the world, and what I want for others is that kind of freedom.
I'm curious what happened in your story that brought you to writing a book about the Advent in Palestine and the realities and the context that affect the people in this region.
I grew up hearing about Israel always, and knew that there were, of course, Jewish people in Israel. That's what I knew. It wasn't until I was in college, so late 80s, early 90s, that I started to hear about trouble in the Middle East. And I was a young college student, and we're curious about the world at that age, or we're starting to be. And by the time I graduated, this chatter, remained pretty pervasive. And I finally had enough time to put down a textbook. And so I picked up a book called From Beirut to Jerusalem by Thomas Friedman. At the time, it was the best-selling book about the Middle East. And I thought, great, I'm going to read this pretty thick book from cover to cover, and I'm going to know what's going on in the Middle East.
Right.
And
I've
that
been there. I
was,
get it.
yeah,
Yeah.
that was the beginning of my journey way back in the early 90s. Of course, what I was reading into would have been, the first Intifada, then we have the second Intifada. I didn't realize then that I was reading into, kind of a pretty active time in the timeline. But that was my introduction that was the first time I ever heard that there were other people. I mean, I knew there were the Arab states around Israel, but that book was the first time I ever heard about Palestinians.
Wow.
I mean, and I'm embarrassed to say it because by this time I was 22, 23 years old, steeped in the church, steeped in the biblical text. I was a good church girl, loved the Bible, and the first time I heard about Palestine was in a best-selling, book written about the region, and I was ashamed that I didn't know. And at that point said, I will never, ever again unsee that there are these other people in the region, in the same land, that have a connection to this same place. And I think this book became, what I never could have foreseen. Back then, I had no idea that I'd ever write or go to seminary or any of the things that happened in the next set of years. But this definitely is an outgrowth of that commitment that I had. Like, man, I will never unsee this. I will never forget these people. That has become true for me.
Absolutely. Wow. I mean, the power of bearing witness in the transformation that it sparks within us, and then to see on this side of it all the fruit that has grown is a gift. So you had this kind of encounter. I know you've visited the region, I believe even with Telos at one
Yes.
point and otherwise, and you decided to write this story of Advent in the region. Tell us first, what even is Advent?
Sure. So, Advent is what we would call an ecclesiastical or a church season. So, the church has a calendar, and Advent is the lead up to Christmas. And of course, then more people are familiar with Lent, which are those 40 days that lead us to Easter. And then we have ordinary time. But this is the season where we start to pay attention to the stories about the birth and arrival of Jesus. I call them the Advent narratives. And this typically is a set of 4 weeks where the church pays attention to these stories. And they tend to pay attention to some themes of hope, of joy, of waiting, anticipation, and really try and lean into those elements that they see in the text and that they hope to see embodied in the world. And so that is, typically there's a lot of, candles and light and that kind of imagery as we kind of move our way towards the birth of Jesus, which we celebrate on Christmas.
That's so helpful, and I appreciate you pulling out some of the themes that are common across, denominations and even Christian traditions during this time. And what I love about your book is that you draw out some of the themes in the Advent narratives that are often overlooked, at least by the communities that I come from, and perhaps you do too. And that's something that I want us to talk about throughout this show. But just to start us off, I'd love to hear more about the context of these Advent narratives that you uncover. You say that writing this book that you wrote is about taking the place, people, and the politics of the land in which the story takes place seriously. And you reference that, in fact, the land itself is often understood as a kind of fifth gospel, referring to how the political and economic realities of the land are integral to the narratives, not secondary, and that they enhance the stories that we read about in the 4 written gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So I'd love to hear what was uncovered for you as you interrogated these stories, these Advent narratives in light of this land, not only as it was 2,000 years ago in the context you're helping us see, but even as it was as you were exploring it today in your own life and seeing it with your own eyes, doing the witnessing that sparks transformation. Can you tell us about that experience?
Sure. I think for me, I went back to the Advent stories because I was needing to shore up my own sense of Advent. I had always been an Advent lover. This was a season that always resonated with me. And then there came a time where I called it my Advent ache. Every time I'd move towards Advent, I'd feel a sense of heaviness and darkness and this real deep awareness of what was not right. Whatever was going on in the news at the time, and it would change from year to year, but that ability to see what was happening that was at odds with God's justice and feeling the weight of it. And so I felt like, everybody else is like Christmas lights and, joy and anticipation. And I felt like I was the dark side of Advent. So I really went back to these texts to try and reorient myself as a person coming out of the Christian tradition and kind of reclaim all those beautiful themes, right? But what I found when I actually went back and just read these Advent narratives, which are in 2 of the 4 Gospels, so in Luke and in Matthew, and I was shocked that what I saw was such a rough terrain. And if you read these stories well, and as somebody who was a student of scripture and who had gone and done advanced work to kind of get some scholarship to my profile, when I read these stories, I was like, these are incredibly political. They are incredibly violent. Like, what this actually did not mesh with what I heard most people talk about during Advent, and actually made me feel quite vindicated in that the darkness that I felt was actually deeply faithful and congruent to the stories that both Matthew and Luke were telling us. So part of what I saw, and maybe the first thing I recognized was, oh, there's deep trauma, generational trauma, that Jewish suffering is what actually is the predicate, what is the foundation to our Advent stories. We tend to kind of jump into the scene with these gospel stories and just as it, Zechariah and Elizabeth, these, old school priest and his wife and their story, and don't realize they're connected to, their parents and grandparents. Well, what was happening for all of them was one empire after another pounding down on the Jewish people. And the trauma, right? The violence, the loss, the being pushed around and always out of place. And that kind of trauma we now know. A lot of us, maybe who are part of the Telos family have traveled maybe to Tel Aviv and traveled into Jerusalem and been able to go to Yad Vashem and witness, like, these are the stories of generational trauma, what happened and how it keeps happening and how it lives in our body and in our psyche. But for me, it was like, oh, but that's what was happening. Zechariah and Elizabeth and all the other people in these Advent stories, they were victims of generational trauma too. And we tend to say, the church history that I come from tends to say, those were silent years. Nothing was happening. For 400 years, it was quiet. God was quiet. And I'm like, if God was quiet, he's the only one. Because actually that landscape, when you look at the history, was loud with violence and loud with lament. Nobody else had the prerogative to be quiet. And so that, I think, totally changed just how I even entered into the stories of recognizing, that Jesus is connected to all of this generational suffering and trauma, and that is in his body and the body of his family and the people that we read about. And that has to be woven into, I thought, our understanding of what was happening in the text. But boy, doesn't that just kind of connect us directly to what we see happening in the region today, as we now have 2 people groups. I mean, I'm being simplistic, but let's say, for our purposes here, we have our Jewish brothers and sisters and we have our Palestinian brothers and sisters who both suffer deep, deep trauma, whether from the Holocaust or from the Nakba. And that is a huge element when I went on my first trip, that I recognized, if you don't take that seriously, you are not going to be able to hear the stories well or understand what's happening. And I felt the same was true when I looked at the biblical text. So that was like my first big, like, oh,
Yeah.
whoa, there's something
Wow.
happening here. But I think the other thing I saw pretty clearly up front was, oh, wait a minute, this happened during the Pax Romana. And I studied, I was a good student in high school when we studied the Roman Empire. And again, when we studied it at college. And it's like, wasn't this supposed to be the time when things were good? Caesar's peace had come. Everybody was supposed to be celebrating. Why was this the particular time that God opted to send his son, or God's son, right? Like, does the timing require, is that an exigence for us to respond to answer? And my sense, which I go on about in the book, is that I think the timing was pretty important, that in the midst of Caesar's peace, God comes in and says, you think this is what peace is? And critiques Caesar's peace. And I would say critiques our peace, our idea, the American idea of peace. We are now the empire. And I think our peace is also being critiqued by these Advent stories. So that was another real important theme for me as I began my exploration was, wow, I think God wants us to really sit and reflect. Is this what peace looks like? Really? This is the best you got? This is what you're willing to settle for? So that's a big part of what I think is happening.
Tell us more about that theme. I mean, one of the in the subtitle of the book even is this theme of reversal of, what you're naming is this peace that was actually not peace, what was violence underneath. And the places where peace was coming and hope was coming were to a young girl birthing a baby in the backwater of the Judean hills in a manger, right? And so this like surprising hope. Tell us more about these reversals that you're discovering in these stories.
You have the superpower and the bigger story, and the big moves were all happening with Rome. Both, and their violence wasn't only a militaristic violence; it was also an economic violence, which I think a lot of times is. Well, I'll just say I've never heard anybody in a church talk about the economic violence of Advent. I mean, I never have. I'd be happy to be wrong, but that was never anything I heard. But there was a lot changing on the economic front, too, at this time in history. And so things that had previously always happened, like debt cancellation and et cetera, Rome had cut off. So now you couldn't count on there being any kind of debt relief or economic reset, which would have been really a big deal for the poor. You can imagine, wow. Right? So there was these twin violences these were the big moves that Rome was doing. But on this micro level, way down in the loam, in the dark soil, are these little things that are starting to change. They are little things in some, like at the time they were, this one woman, young girl really, who was probably the victim of violence. It was a real, Galilee at the time was a really violent, chaotic space. There was a lot of trouble happening. There was always a protest or a funeral or soldiers being sent out to try and put down one little rebellion or some banditry. There's always stuff going on there. So she grew up in this, which tells me that she probably wasn't like the wilting violet that we sometimes think, that she probably had a little bit of something, to her growing up in this space. But here's this young girl, she's pregnant, and somehow she steps into this story, is invited to see God overshadowing her and and making this pregnancy something different. But she steps into this story and gathers up just enough courage to say, I'm going to have this baby, even under the roughest of circumstances. And I understand that God is doing something in me. And she speaks it out into her community. We have that beautiful Magnificat where she's singing about, the elites being pulled down off of their thrones, and the people who are fat cats now are going to have empty pockets, and the people who are hungry now, one day they're the ones who are going to be full. Like she is dreaming of revolution. She is dreaming of liberation. She's my she's the prototype liberation theologian for me.
Absolutely.
Right. But she she articulates something different that she sees happening in God raising her up. And the word lowly that we sometimes think is like Mary, meek, and mild. Actually, the history of that word in this original languages is like Dinah, like some of these other women in the Old Testament who were abused. God is going to redeem me in my state of having been abused by this violent territory, this violent place. God's going to take that and pull me up and redeem, the part of me that has been, again, here we come to that theme of trauma, having been downtrodden and abused. And, I'm going to, by God's grace, God is doing something different in this story. But gosh, who else was going to be looking at this young woman, or Zechariah and his wife, he was just an ordinary priest. He wasn't a high priest. He wasn't a powerful man. He was like a local church pastor. I often think of him like somebody who's right in the, is pastoring a church right in, a little community in Nebraska, or, a little community out in Iowa, and he's got his little pulpit and he's faithful, but he's a bivocational guy because he doesn't get enough from the big denomination to make it. So he's also working part-time at the factory or part-time at the, right. And he's making it work. He's loving his people, but he's nobody. And yet he gets to have a front row seat to some of the most innovative theology as his wife and her cousin, right, Elizabeth and Mary, sit and talk about what God is doing in their very bodies. Wow. As they recognize God is doing something different in us. What is that? What is God doing? And I just think, these little reversals that are happening where you would not look, where you would not think, and yet God is active in. These are the seeds to reversal. These are the little seeds that start to sprout and give us hope that something different, a less violent kingdom, a less male-centered kingdom, a less, you just start thinking a less,
exploitative system, right? And all of those things
could be happening, could be sprouting underneath our feet, maybe.
Absolutely. And what a, seeds and hints to and whispers of, what is coming, as you're saying, and not only in the incarnation of Christ, but in the story and vision he's offering us in his ministry of this kingdom of God. That is so different. It's like an inversion, a reversal of the empire in which he walks in Judea of that time. One of the things you're doing here is challenging so many misconceptions that we have as modern Western readers of these texts, and it's so helpful. And one of the things I was even thinking about recently is how you interrogate this little line about there being no room at the inn, and this idea that we have in the West of like, well, they're just kicked out. They're left out to dry in the cold of winter. That's actually not what's happening. Can you just quickly tell us what went wrong for us? Yeah.
I mean, there was some mistranslation, which is what got us to where we are. But I'll let the book do the heavy lifting, and there are plenty of footnotes to get you there if you pick up the book. But I think we have been told that this was this inhospitable place that Mary and Joseph arrived to right on the cusp of her giving birth. And my birth mother is Hispanic, and so we have a big, there's a tradition of Las Positas, where you go knocking, we have this whole tradition where you're knocking on the door, and nope, there's no room here. You go knocking on the next, nope, there's no, it's a big thing we lean into, that there's no room at the inn. But that's actually not what the story's saying. What the story is actually saying is that there wasn't a particular space, a particular kind of space in a home that typically could be on offer, wasn't available. Because if you follow the logic of the story as Luke tells it, there was this big census, and everybody had to register for the census, which, by the way, is all about taxation, which is always about extracting more money from the poorest. So huge trigger to tell us there was a huge time of economic stress. Everybody's under stress. They have to get to their hometowns, at least Luke, the way Luke tells the story. They have to get there to register. And so everybody's flooding to their home cities, including Bethlehem. There's no room for it. Well, it just means that Well, maybe if you believe Luke, the way he tells the story, everybody was crowding in and coming back home. And so every corner of the homes family compounds were full. We were really being told is like every single corner of this family compound was full. So while we couldn't give them the space we normally would give them, of course there was going to be space for him to be welcomed home with his young bride. Of course. And I remember talking to Chef Fadi, who runs an inn right on Star Street in Bethlehem. And he said, he found that story so offensive. Pilgrims would come every year. They'd come down Star Street and talk about these stories. And he's like, but that's not who we are. We always welcome people. Our culture as Palestinians is to host people, to feed them well, to give them a safe place. And there's no vision of a woman in distress that we would not have taken in then or now. I mean, he just was like, he found it so offensive that is kind of how the world views Bethlehemites, that's my picture based on all the work is that no, they came in, they were welcomed into the compound. It was bustling, tons of cousins and branches of, cousins they hadn't even met. And everybody was new to Mary, meeting his family. But in the process, eventually she gets close. In my own imagination is that Elizabeth, Ein Kerem is close enough to Jerusalem, and she would have known when her cousin, about the time. My guess is she made her way. In my understanding is, I think that Elizabeth would have been there for her. They shared too much for her to not do everything she could to have been there too. And so I imagine all the women in the kitchen cutting tomatoes and cucumbers, making one of those lovely big, Palestinian salads we love. And her water breaks. And all of these women wash up their hands and become midwives. And they surround her. They put her in a place that's safe. They are with her. Elizabeth is holding her hand as Jesus is being born into the world, surrounded by his family. I don't think she was alone in some far off hill. I think she was in the thick of women who cared about her and who knew this was the newest member to their family. Joseph had his cousins and his kin around him. And I think it was a joyous, beautiful arrival.
Wow. It's such a different picture than the ones that I grew up with or that I, put together in nativity scenes every year, right?
Right.
And of this barn that happens to have the savior of the world, in a little manger. And so, and what I think is so powerful about this image is this picture of shalom, of connection, of family surrounding this birth of what the Bible even talks about of, the new Adam, right? Where in the original story of the garden, you have this Adam being born into shalom, but being born alone, right? And saying this, there's no one here like me. And yet in this story, this new Adam, you have this family of hospitality that the story that we often have in our heads of inhospitality or being inhospitable is actually, no, we will make space for you, even though there's no space. We will find a way, and that it's actually a radical welcome that we're seeing here.
Which is a huge act of subversion, isn't it? Because at this time, Caesar is doing everything he can. Like, it's so onerous, all this. And yet we are still going to welcome each other. We are still going to love each other. We are still going to, when I think of these women becoming midwives to Mary, I can't help but think about the midwives who pushed back against Pharaoh.
Right.
Right. This idea that, no, we're still going to do the things that are loving and hospitable and gracious with one another. You aren't going to reduce us to animals. We are still humans who love each other and show up for each other. And to me, their hospitality is a huge subversive move. You could easily miss, but I think they refuse to let their humanity be diminished by the empire.
Wow. That's such a powerful story. And I think in some ways it brings us to the modern context. I mean, even just your experience being on the ground in Bethlehem helped you put this story together in new ways, gave you a new imagination for what may have been happening. But it also gave you an awareness of how these stories of of empire, of extraction, of oppression, even, are still relevant in these lands today, in this land that Jesus graced. So I would love to hear more about your reflections, particularly on and how you see the Advent story connecting to this part of the world today. Especially in light of the past 14 months almost now since the attacks of October 7th, and just the months on end of devastation and destruction and death that we've seen in Gaza. This Advent story still has a word to say. Tell us, how have you been thinking about that, what you've been noticing and paying attention to, and where you might see those connections being drawn.
Well, I think this is the part, of the story that I pull from Matthew, which is a much darker part of the story, right? So we've kind of harmonized these two stories from these two gospel writers to give us this beautiful Christmas image that there were Mary and Joseph and Jesus and animals, and also angels and magi, and but they were not all together in one story. The magi come from a completely different story written by a different author, and that's Matthew. Much darker articulation of what God's arrival looked like. And that is really the one I've been sitting with since 10/7. And I don't think this is anything revolutionary or deeply insightful, other than, of course, the slaughter of the innocents is where I find the deep connection. Herod had the most sophisticated military apparatus, but what people don't realize, historically, he was known for having amazing surveillance. So the first time I went to Israel, Palestine, I was with Telos. So that was the first time I was crossed the checkpoint into Bethlehem and beyond. But the second time I went, I stayed in Bethlehem, and we got to know a taxi driver really well. To this day, we still text and send pictures back and forth with Naif. He's so fabulous. But he's like, I have to take you to my favorite place. And it's Herodium, right? So it's right outside of Bethlehem, on the edge of Bethlehem, but it's, looks like it's a big man-made mountain. And he had to take me to the top to get a view. But what he realized he was showing me is like, oh, this was part of Herod's surveillance apparatus. He could see, so my friend Naif was telling me, look, you can see all the way to Jericho, and you can see all the way. But in my head, I'm like, oh, Herod could see all that too, But he also had, networks and the kind of communication that happens among people, the grapevine, etc. But he was known for having a really very thick intelligence agency when you do the historical work. And you mean to tell me that this person didn't have the capacity for a more surgical operation in Bethlehem to find this one undefended, innocent civilian? You mean to tell me that his crazy, big, fabulous, sophisticated at the time apparatus couldn't have a more strategic way of getting in and getting out with that child? It sounds to me like, gee whiz, all of the defense at the hands of the state of Israel, empowered by my U.S. tax dollars and some of our very weaponry. You mean to tell me with all that sophistication that they couldn't help but bomb hospitals and bakeries and universities and wipe out entire family? You mean to tell me with all of this military prowess that they rave about, that they couldn't do a more surgical operation that didn't kill how many thousands of? No. But this has been happening since Herod. This is nothing new. So, I come right back to the fact that these, as Matthew shows us, the atrocities keep coming. The atrocities keep coming. According to Matthew, Jesus is born, and then Herod comes after him. and wipes out not just Bethlehem. If you read the text carefully, it's the vicinity. It's the whole vicinity that get wiped. All those boys get wiped out in pursuit of one. And then, right, become political refugees. I think that's another part of the story that kind of haunts me, is that while Jesus, is whisked away because an angel let Joseph know it's time to go, all of those other families in Bethlehem and the surrounding areas were trapped. Nobody gave them a heads up. It reminds me of all of the families in Gaza who were trapped. There's nowhere to go. I look again at this old story and say, that is what they experienced. That is what we are told. And it keeps happening. People being trapped, in the net of violence with nowhere to go. Nowhere to go. And so we hear Mother Rachel weeping over all the lost children. So this is from Matthew in his gospel, quotes the prophet Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is the one who talks about Mother Rachel weeping for her children. In the Jewish tradition, Rachel's lament is legend. She is like the woman, the representative of a mother lamenting the loss of her children. And so, the gospel writer pulls from this prophet, to say, yeah, this is what was required, that it is like this bereft, the ultimate bereft mother weeping over what is happening at the slaughter of all those innocents. And I feel like she's weeping still as she looks at Gaza, except I think now what I would say is that she's not just weeping at the loss of all of those children in Gaza, men and women as well. But when I think about her as the lamenting mother for all the children lost in Gaza, I think she would have quite a pointed word for all of us. And you still let this happen? You still have not found a way around all of the violence? What kind of progress, right? That doesn't look like, I think Isaiah, I think the prophet Jeremiah, I think they assumed that the world would move towards greater mechanisms of peace, and we have not. And I think they would turn their fingers to us and say, what are you doing that you still have not advanced the cause of God's peace? So I think, I feel a bit of the frustration, the deep lament, but also the deep frustration that the text pushes towards me, like that we are still here. Mm-hmm. And now it is happening in real time, that we can see, if we have eyes to see, we can see what's happening to these families and hear the heartbreak. I mean, that's where I'm at.
Wow. That's such a powerful word for us to hear, Kelley, for you to draw those connections and to invite us into the lament as Rachel did, and to help us recognize that this involves us, and that to practice Advent is not just to sing songs and give gifts or even read the stories, but it's to do the work of justice and of liberation and of peace. In fact, you say in your book, how God entered the world matters. Where and when God chose to come into the world carries significance. Advent is not about one season of devotion. Rather, the Advent narratives orient us toward a lifetime of faithfulness to the God of liberation, love, and peace. And right now, as you're saying, that faithfulness looks like standing up to these forces and these systems and these policies done in our name that continue only to bring horror to millions of people. That's what faithfulness looks like right now. I'm curious if you have any other word of how we as Americans listening, as American Christians, might practice Advent this year in light of the Holy Land, in light of Palestine as it is today.
I mean, that is a really hard one. Of course, we just, you and I are talking, just after we have entered into the Advent season proper. And I'm still trying to figure out, how do I best embody, Advent this year? Because I think what the texts push and ask us this season is, what kind of peace do you want? And at what price? as Matthew tells the story, when Herod realized there was a new king that might threaten his throne, this baby Jesus, he was shook, as was everybody around him. It said all of Jerusalem was shook. And I think what the gospel writer is wanting to tell us is they had a system that was working for them, not for everybody, but their little cabal right, it was working for them. They had figured out how to make it work. And they were, even if they maybe weren't Roman, they knew how to work the system so that they could get something a little extra for them and their family. They made it work. And if there is a new order on the horizon, it is going to cause chaos. We may lose the sweet deals we had been navigating and working for all these years. And, everybody was like, oh, I don't want a new peace, because I figured out how to make this one work for me and my family. Of course, those are the ones near the top. That certainly wasn't the case for most people during the first century. But I kind of feel a bit of that. Like, we want our peace as Americans, but at what price? At the price of Palestinian entire family lines wiped. Are we okay with that? Is that a reasonable price for us to have some kind of status quo in terms of American foreign diplomacy? I tend to agree with Jimmy Carter, and I tend to agree with Ta-Nehisi Coates, who also made his own pilgrimage to Palestine. This is apartheid. Are we okay with peace for us, America first, at the price of apartheid? Somewhere else, anywhere else, but here in the Holy Land, we're okay with that. Is that a price we are willing to pay? I think a lot of people don't know. They don't have the terms to know, if I'm being a little more compassionate. But in my commitment to liberation, I can lean towards being a little more on the strident side, I confess. But it's like, are you willing to, is your peace worth that? And I just think for a lot of people who know that it kind of is. I think that is not the kind of Advent question we typically think of. We think of, how am I going to rest this season? How am I going to welcome Jesus this season? But I think it's like, this is more the point of the Advent stories, is what kind of peace and at what price. In terms of practices, I really do think lament is the foremost practice for Advent, is allowing there to be space to see the sadness and hold it and feel it. Frederick Buechner uses this wonderfully evocative phrase in his book, Telling the Truth. And he talks about obeying the sadness of our time. He didn't name that as lament, but I recognize that to be such a beautiful description of it, to obey the sadness of our time. The sadness that we would accept this apartheid as acceptable being done in our name as U.S. taxpayers, right? That we would watch these families perish. And that is deeply sad. I think that lament is very active, and I think his phrasing, to obey, that is the action that I choose to take during Advent, is to make space to, yes, listen to the news that's coming out of the region and not turn away from it. But I think there are other ways that we can listen to the voices. I have some of my favorite Palestinian poets. There are storytellers, novelists and other writers. The chef I mentioned has a cookbook that was just awarded one of the best cookbooks of 2024 by the LA Times. And I love to cook, some of these recipes he taught me during COVID over text. He would tell me to try these things. But now I have the book, and just yesterday we were texting and celebrating together, but cooking his food and reading the stories of his people that he has put in this beautiful book. Right? These are all ways for me that lament isn't only, yes, it is the sadness, but it is also just the stories, recognizing the fullness of these brothers and sisters and their beautiful culture, and allowing that so that then I can really grieve it because I know what's at stake. I know some people do the candles. There's a Christian tradition around Advent where you have a wreath on the table. And then there's 4 candles, and you light one for every week of Advent, along with these themes. But I actually preserve lemons. So that's something I started the year I wrote this book. And Chef taught me how to do that. But it actually takes 4 weeks to preserve lemons. And of course, preserved lemons are one of the foods that he and his family in Bethlehem love, and part of the cuisine in the region. And so I preserve lemons during Advent. And so they sit on my kitchen counter all 4 weeks. And you kind of watch these beautiful, hard. They're hard at the beginning, right? A lemon, but you put it in this jar with some salt, and you kind of watch it over the weeks transform. These big tough lemons collapse, which to me is such a picture of lament and loss, right? They collapse down, but by the end, 4 weeks later, they are softened and sweetened and edible. Every part, even the peel that you normally think, ooh, that peel is just too bitter. And no, 4 weeks in, it has been transformed. And for me, that has become like a picture of, yes, you could say a light in the darkness with the candles, but there's something to me so much more evocative about these lemons that actually do take a different shape 4 weeks in, and then become something that I use all year long in my cuisine. So every time I pull them out, I'm thinking of Chef and his family and my other Palestinian friends, so that lament pulls all the way through the year for me in a very tangible. I need things that are tangible. I wear my key, my little key. The first time that Todd and the friends at Telos took me to Ada refugee camp, and I saw the big key, I came home and I got one, and I have worn this every day since. That's what I was there in May of 2017. Every day I put this on, and it's a way of remembering all those people who can't put a key in their home, in the lock of their home, because they've been pushed out. But they hope for, they pray for a return, And so every day I put this on and remember and say a prayer as I put it on. I need my lament to be that tangible, whether it's preserved lemons in my food or something I wear. I wear my keffiyeh a lot these days. So these are ways that at least I carry that with me.
I love that image and the story of the lemons. I've never heard of that before, but what a powerful, evocative picture of this process of lament, of really grieving, of experiencing a painful transformation, but seeing on the other side this memory that out of which emerges the possibility of hope and the possibility of justice, and even possibly of joy in the midst of that. And so thank you for the invitation to sit in the grief, to lament, to listen well this Advent. It is so essential for those of us, especially in the U.S., to really listen to the folks from the region, to Palestinian Christians, to folks in Gaza who are experiencing this day in and day out. That is really so much of our work. And then ultimately, once we've committed to listening, to participate in owning our agency where we have it, to transforming our implication, our engagement and participation in this violence. So that is the invitation I'm receiving from you this Advent, and I'm so, so grateful for it. And I hope you all who are listening go out and buy The First Advent in Palestine, Reversals, Resistance, and the Ongoing Complexity of Hope. It is such a powerful book. It is worth reading this Advent and again next year. And perhaps you can send us a picture of your preserved lemons after this show. We'd love to share them on our social media. But Kelley, it's been such a gift to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Folks, thanks for listening. As always, you can leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And if you're enjoying this podcast, we invite you to consider becoming a donor to Telos. We're in our end-of-year campaign trying to raise the funds we need to keep doing this work alongside you. But we're grateful that you're leaning in, you're lamenting with us, and we'll see you next time.